And the goal is to give you an intuitive understanding. So we will not go deep into the maths, but rather I will focus on the practical aspects and practical applications. I will use some simplifications. So I will be favoring clarity over precision. I will basically use plain language to give you an idea of what's ergodicity and why it's so important. And if you are interested instead in formal understanding and understanding the math behind it, I suggest the works of Oli Peters and Alexander Adamov, for example, who are two of the people who are produced most of the work and especially recently on the field. I will begin with the same story that begins my book, and that's the story of my cousin. My cousin was born on a village on the French Alps, and that's a place where you learn to ski before you learn to read. And he is very good at skiing, and soon he began participating to competitions, and he even made it to the World Cup for his age bracket. But then around the age of 16 years old, he began having one leg injury, another leg injury, and by the age of 20, he had to abandon competitive skiing. And from his story, I learned that it's not the fastest skiers that become world champions and are the most successful, but it's the fastest ones between those who survive. And that's actually a principle for life that we can see in a lot of applications. For example, startups. The startups we see are not necessarily the best startups, but the best startups between those that survived. Or even employees. The most successful employees are not necessarily the most performant ones, but are the most performant ones that didn't burn out. Or investments. Again, the most performant investments are the ones that did not go bankrupt at some point of their life or had to liquidate, so that staying long, it allowed them to compound. And many more examples. But, and this is critical, here I'm not just making the point that survival matters, which is very banal, but instead here I'm making the much stronger point that survival matters more than performance. And if you don't believe me, we can just crunch some numbers. And let's make the example of a ski championship that has 10 races. And my cousin has a 20% chance of winning each race and a 20% chance of breaking his leg. And the question is, how many races he's expected to win in the championship on average? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read the problem. And the naive answer would be 2 races. And that's because there are 10 races total, and he has a 20% chance of winning each, and 10 times 20% equals 2 races. But that's the wrong answer. The real answer is much lower. And the reason is because he has also a 20% chance of breaking his leg. That means that he only has 80% chance of participating to the second race. Because of course, if he breaks his leg, he will not recover fast enough to participate to the second race. And therefore, the chances of winning the second race are lower than 20%. They are 20% given he participates, but there is only 80% chance of that. So you multiply the two percentages and it gives you only a 16% chances of winning the second race. And then you can keep doing this reasoning. So he has only an 80% chance of participating to the third race, given that he participated to the second one. So the percentages of being able to participate to further races, they go down and down. And also the chances of winning go consequently down and down. And then if you actually run the numbers, that's how it looks like. The probabilities of participating and thus finishing and thus winning go down with each race. And until you get a sum of only 0.71 wins. So that's much less than the 2 races that were expected if there were no irreversibility in breaking his leg. And irreversibility is the key word when we talk about ergodicity. Uh, because in a lot of fields in life, ergodicity absorbs future, irreversibility absorbs future gains. And we see it in skiing. So for example, if my cousin breaks his leg, that's something irreversible, and that absorbs the future possible gains he will have. So his chances of winning future races. And this also applies, for example, in relationships. So it's true that usually in relationships, in friendships, the more time you spend with one person, the deeper goes the relationship. But if you have a fight with that person, as a result, the person doesn't want to see you anymore, then you forgo the possibility of spending time with them, and therefore of deepening the relationship again. Or another example is with the stock market. So it's true that the stock market over time, on the long term, always goes up. At least that's historically been true. But the key word is over the long term. If you stay invested for the long term, probably your investment is expected to go up. But if there is a downturn and you are over leveraged, and you have to exit the investment or you go bankrupt, then and then there is a rebound, you forego the gains of the rebound. So the rebound is what makes the average goes up. But if there was something irreversible before that didn't allow you to benefit from the rebound, then you will not benefit from that. And the average return for you from the stock market will be much lower. Then a common comment that I get is that people tell me, Luca, what you say only applies to the long term, but winning a race is about the short term. A skier can just risk it all to win one race. And this is true, except that you never skied and just participate to a race. In order to do that, you need to have practice for years. You need to have raced for years. And these are all risks of injuries. So what we witness is that in life, even short-term performance is actually a form of long-term performance, because the long-term was the training and the milestones that you go through. And that this long-term means that you were exposed to irreversibility. And only if you were taking precautions and you were not taking risks that exposed you too much to irreversibility, you got to the point where in the last step, it looks like it was just a short term, a matter of the short term. But usually it's always about the long term. Now, here is the rule of thumb. You do not want to maximize growth. What you want to do is maximize growth that conserves survival. So you do not want to ever compromise on survival. And this is a simple example. An application would be: do not work as hard as you can, but work as hard as you can while avoiding a burnout and other negative consequences on health or your personal lives or your family. And the way you do that is that you make a difference. You differentiate between a risk that you can recover from and risk whose consequences can permanently debilitate you. And ideally, you want to expose yourself to the former, but not expose you to the latter. You want to expose you to risks, but not to irreversibility. And there is a sweet spot where you can do that, and that's usually a very good place to aim for. Now, let's see a definition of ergodicity. So first we will see a technical definition of ergodicity, which says that something is ergodic if its ensemble average and its time averages are the same. I will not go to explain what that means. I will give you a more incomplete but easier to understand definition. And that's that an activity is ergodic if its outcome is the same for many people performing it once and for one person performing it many times. And the best way to explain it is with an example, as always. For example, in dating, if you date one person 10 times, you get a very different outcome than if you date 10 people once. You get different kinds of relationships. So different averages, it's non-ergodic. Another example is baking. If you get 10 people who never baked a cake before, and you get them to bake one cake, the outcome will be 10 terrible cakes. Conversely, if you get one person who never baked a cake before, and you tell her to bake 10 cakes, then you get 2 bad cakes at the beginning and 8 good cakes at the end after she learned. So again, you get 2 different outcomes. In the first case, many people performing the activity once, you get 10 bad cakes. Second case, one person performing it many times, you get 2 bad cakes and 8 good cakes. Different outcomes, so that's non-ergodic. And that matters because when something is non-ergodic, you cannot rely on the average, or you cannot extrapolate from one single instance. So baking cakes is non-ergodic, so you cannot extrapolate how baking many cakes looks like from just baking one cake. There are other applications. So for example, behavioral change is non-ergodic. Let's make the example, you are a manager, and as a manager, you want your people to, for example, adopt a new practice. And if you remind them once per month, you can go on for the rest of your career reminding them once per month, and they will not change their ways. Conversely, if you remind them once a day for 1 month, they will probably change, and the change is there to stay. Another example, the tragedy of the commons is about non-ergodicity. The common example is that the tragedy of the commons, you have a village and there is a forest next to the village. And if one person goes to cut the tree, the outcome is that they have wood to heat their house. And one person can go cutting a tree for many years, and the outcome is always the same. They get wood and heating. Conversely, if all the people in the village, they go 1 year to cut the trees, then the outcome is, yes, they get some wood for heating, but also the forest disappears. And then the next years, they don't have wood anymore. So again, the tragedy of the commons, one person performing the activity many times is different from many people performing the activity once, concentrated in times. And that's another cool application of ergodicity. It means that you cannot just use the averages blindly. You need to consider average for whom, average how long, and so on and so forth. So let's see another rule of thumb. When there is the possibility of irreversibility of something that has permanent consequences, you cannot blindly rely on averages. A common example is the train that goes to the airport. You cannot blindly rely on the fact that on average the train has 10 minutes delay. Because the day that it's 30 minutes late, you lose your plane. And that's irreversible. If the next time you are 30 minutes in advance, they're not gonna give you a second ticket. And that's because of this irreversibility that the average doesn't count, or counts very limitedly, but that's not all that matters. Another example, again, is the stock market. We've seen it before. If there is some irreversibility, so for example, some market downturn that causes you to go out of business or to exit your investment, then you will not benefit from a subsequent rebound. So again, in this case, you do not only care about the average of what stock do, you also care about something else. You care whether you will stay in the business long enough so that the average realizes. And that's the point, that's the thing about averages. We rely on averages, are always assuming the law of large numbers. So what's the law of large numbers? Um, Example: you flip a coin once, and you will get either you will get either a head or tails. You flip it 3 times, and maybe you get 2 heads, 1 tail, and it looks like the probabilities of having heads is 67%. And then you flip it 10 times, and maybe it's 6 times heads, 4 times tails, and so the probabilities of getting heads, they go 60%. And then you keep flipping the coin, and over the time, the probabilities of getting heads will converge to the expected ones, which is 50%. And that's what the law of large numbers tells you, that the more trials you do, the more the result will converge on the expected one, for example, for the coin, on the 50%. But, and that's a but, that's a big but, it assumes, averages assume that you will repeat the activity long enough to reach the average. And in the real world, that's very often not the case. And we see it, for example, with Russian roulette. Russian roulette is this gambler's game. Do not try it at home, where you take a gun and you put one single bullet in the barrel, and then you randomly spin the barrel, you put the gun to your head, and you pull the trigger. And then, of course, you have 1 chance out of 6 of dying, and 5 chances out of 6 of surviving and winning a cash prize. And let's say, for example, that the cash prize is $6,000. What's the expected, what's the average outcome of playing the Russian roulette? And again, a naive answer would be $5,000. And that's because the prize is $6,000, but you have a 5 in 6 chances of winning the prize, and 5/6 of 6,000, it's $5,000. But that's not the case, because if you play Russian roulette 10 times, what you win is not 10 times the average outcome, so $50,000. What happens most likely is that you're dead. And if you're dead, you cannot play Russian roulette again, and you cannot collect any prize. So your winnings actually go to 0. So again, Russian roulette, there is irreversibility, so we cannot rely on averages, because averages assume large numbers of attempts, and the irreversibility might prevent you from reaching the large number of attempts. And in this case, we are in a non-ergodic condition. Here is actually how it looks like if you run the numbers. You see that very soon the average outcome converges down to 0. And that's something that you need to be very careful about, because if you do not know about this phenomena, you will take wrong decision. You will measure the average outcome of something, and you will take a cost-benefit decision based on the average outcome, and that might just be wrong. This is the principle. To apply the level of large numbers, and so to rely on averages, you must guarantee a large number of attempts and have no irreversibility. And very often that's not the case. But there are strategies to improve your chances of that. For example, to improve the chances that you will have a large number of attempts, and so you will be more likely to reap the average returns. And the reason why there are these strategies is because ergodicity is not just the property of just an activity. For example, Russian roulette, earlier I said that it's non-ergodic, but that's not true, not always. Russian roulette is non-ergodic if you are the player. But if instead you are a company that employs Russian roulette players, then it's almost non-ergodic, because you do not, one Russian roulette player shooting himself in the head, it's irreversible for him, but it's not irreversible for you. You can just hire another one. So more in general, we can say that ergodicity is the property of an actor, an activity, and the exposure of the former to the latter, and a few more factors that I'm not covering here. But that's very important. It's not just a definition, but if ergodicity is the property of an actor, then it means that you can adapt, that the actor can adapt to make himself more resistant or less exposed to irreversibility. Or similarly, you can change the activity. So for example, investments might be non-ergodic if you invest in a single stock, but might almost become ergodic if you invest in a large portfolio of uncorrelated assets. Now, of course, I'm saying almost because it's not fully true, but might be true enough to be what matters in a limited span of time, which might be a human life, for example. And so there are strategies to do that, to manage non-ergodicity. In my book, I talk about some of them. I present more example of ergodicity, of its application. I talk more about the definition. I go both in the formal and in the less formal. So I focus to give definitions that make sense in real life for everyday people. So not necessarily people that are investors or that engage in Russian roulette, but for normal people that are doing everyday activities. I talk about strategies to manage non-ergodicity, such as the distribution, insurances, methods to limit exposure. And I talk about how ergodicity influences human behavior. So for example, there is one of the works by Ol Peters and his team is, she shows that what we previously believed in behavioral economics, that humans are risk averse and that's an irrational bias. Actually, the behavior that naively we would say that are risk averse, actually they are optimal behaviors. And that's because the world is non-ergodic. And then in my book, I make another example, more original, in which I show that moods are adaptations to a non-ergodic world. So we will also talk about psychology in the book. And yeah, I published this book in November. It got great reviews since then. And you can get it, the ebook on my website or on Gumroad, or also on Apple Books and Google Play Store. And then the hardcover and the paperback, you can get them on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.